Welcome everyone to this evening's lecture by Martine Petlund Breiby. I've known Martine for a couple of years now. She has visited the Institute first time in 2016 during a student course, and then she has returned both for further studies, and she has now completed her Master of Arts in Archaeology this year, and she is now a research assistant at the Department of Archaeology in Oslo, at the University of Oslo. But as the good friend of the Institute that she is, she has also, in addition to her studies, also participated in our field work here. She has been a survey assistant at the NASK project, the archaeological survey in the Karistia. In 2016, she has participated in Søren Handberg's excavations at Kalidon. That's the Danish Institute, but Søren Handberg is at Martine's home department in Oslo. And she has also been a lab assistant at the University of Oslo on a more medieval project from Clemenskirken, a middle-aged church located in Oslo. And since she had previously also worked in the Karistia, she has returned this year and participated in the first season of the Gurimadi archaeological project there. So this is why it's a special pleasure for us to have you with us here to give a lecture tonight. And I should also say, of course, that this is part of the program we have in our travel stipends, and then we ask the award holders to also give a lecture here. So this means that Martine has also received our travel stipend. So please, you can introduce the topic yourself.
Yes, hello. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to present my results from my master thesis. In archaeological contexts, children are typically discussed as a single undifferentiated group. The separation of subgroups within childhood through the spatial remains of artifacts has, however, proven itself possible. In 1995, Sanne Hube-Nielsen performed a study on the mortuary practices of Hieromycos in Athens, looking at patterns among the grave goods. During this process, she found that age groups within children separated themselves quite clearly from one another. She was able to separate the children through the mortuary practices into three categories or age groups. This recreation of subgroups of children is now widely accepted as the Athenian way of dividing children based on age at death. 23 years has passed, and no study has attempted the same, at least not to my knowledge. So my question is, was this an Athenian phenomenon or not? For my master thesis, I performed a diachronic comparative analysis of all burials from the North Cemetery at Corinth, sorry, I lost myself there. With the goal of identifying subgroups within child burials based on age. I chose the North Cemetery at Corinth based as it has a good sample size of child burials, and because it differs to some degree from the practices found in Hieromycos and Athens. Today I want to give you an insight into the whole time period, 700 to 400 BC, but I will mainly present the patterns from 599 to 500, as this century had the most obvious patterns and also were perhaps the most interesting ones. So before I do this, I would like to just set the stage. What is our typical perception of an ancient Greek child burial? First of all, children were inhumed rather than cremated traditionally, even in places where cremation was the routine treatment of children, of adults. Athens being an example of this. Gillian B. Shepard has suggested that this might be related to the practical difficulties of incinerating a small body with low body fat. Pliny the Elder states that the teeth are the only part of the body which resists the action of fire. And he goes on saying that it is the custom of most nations not to burn bodies of children who die before they have cut the teeth. Regardless of the reason not to incinerate a young, it was a tradition upheld in both Greek and Roman antiquity. The use of enkitrismos burials for infants, another tradition found throughout both Greek and Roman antiquity, was probably not just based on practicality. The lack of grandeur given to these containers, normally being horseware jugs or jars such as pithos, hydria, or amphora, could give the impression that almost any container was acceptable for the body of an infant. Contradicting this is the use of a container in the first place. It would be easier to just perform an earth burial, also an accepted form of burial, used for adults and children older than infancy. Simon Hilson has suggested that the enkitrismos burial was used as a metaphor for the womb. Robert Hurst argued that within the same society, the emotions provoked by death varies greatly in intensity according to the social character of the deceased. The individuals who are not fully integrated into society at the time of death requires fewer rites of incorporation into the invisible society. Hence, the metaphor for the womb seems to fit quite nicely, as the infant would be more a part of the world before birth than the world of the living society. What more would an infant need for the journey to the underworld than the womb that had nourished it to life in the first place? And children older than infancy are normally found buried in the same way as adults, except not cremated, in either earth burials, wooden coffins, or sarcophagi burials. The amount of grave gifts also seem to increase with age. Within cemeteries, children are also often discussed as clustering and are found buried close to other children. The objects that are regarded as typical in child burials are toys like terracotta dolls of women, figurines, animals or rattles, drinking cups, where the one handler seems to have a specific connection to the very young, miniature vessels, and seashells. I would now like to present the age groups and how they were defined both in Athens and in Corinth. So the skeletal remains were unfortunately in such a disintegrated state in Corinth that when excavated, only 16 out of the 369 burials were possible to age determine anthropologically. So the opportunity to determine the subdivisions of the child through the skeletal remains is unfortunately lost. Fortunate for me, however, Sanne Hube Nielsen was confronted with the same problem with the material record from Kerameikos and dealt with it in a delicate manner. She divided the material into 4 different age groups. Age group 1, belonging to children up to the age of 1, found as urn burials. Age group 2, belonging to children from 1 to 3 years, found in terracotta basins measuring between 80 to 95 centimeters, or coffins and earth burials measuring less than or equal to approximately 1 meter. Age group 3, belonging to children between 3 or 4 up to the age of about 10 years, at death, found in graves measuring between approximately 1 meter and 1.5 meter. While age group 4, belonging to adults, or every burial over every child over the age of around 10, were found as all burials over 150 centimeters and all cremation burials. In Athens, adults were cremated and children inhumed. In Corinth, inhumation was practiced throughout 700 to 400 BC, making the distinctions a bit harder to make. So from 700 to about 550 BC, the practice of placing the dead in a contracted position rather than in an extended position also made the distinctions a bit harder. I did, as is quite obvious, base my subgroups on Hube-Nielsen's, but had to tweak them a bit. As sarcophagi burials was the norm for both adults and children in Corinth, the burials belonging to age group 1 is defined as all urn burials and sarcophagi burials that do not exceed 50 centimeters in internal length. Age group 2 was defined as all graves between the internal length of 50 to 90 centimeters, and age group 3 are all graves between the internal length of 90 to 125 centimeters, where the position of the skeleton can be determined. Age group 4 are all graves over the length of 125 centimeters, where the position of the skeleton could not be determined. So, as is painfully obvious, these 4 different age groups will leave some error in the statistical results. First of all, the 3 groups of children used can easily be criticized as being too wide in age gaps. In skeletal remains of infants, many different growth stages can be determined through, for example, the approximate femur length. And as is quite obvious from the slide, some of the individuals are placed in burials that do not fit their body. All of the graves here would probably have been included in age group 3 in Athens. These are from Corinth. As was quite obvious from the descriptions of these graves in the publication, however, they all belong to adults. So, in the publication of the North Cemetery, it is stated that fine distinctions as between children and infants were not possible. And when they counted all urn burials and graves under 125 centimeters in length, the grave of children amounted to about 37%. The percentage I reached was 40. So, as for the distribution within the cemetery, the division ended up looking like this. Overall, we have 53 age group 1 burials, 67 age group 2 burials, 28 age group 3 burials, and 195 age group 4 burials. 26 of the 369 graves were unfortunately not possible to determine as belonging to any of the groups, as their graves were either too disturbed or either due to grave robbery or reuse of the grave at a later time. So overall, we have 148 child burials from 700 to 400 BC in Athens. And already we can see that the child burials do not seem to follow the pattern normally seen. There are no obvious clusters of child burials. The different age groups are quite evenly spread throughout the used space of the cemetery. So, from 700 to 600 BC, there were a total of 66 burials, and I found 13 age group 1 burials, 13 age group 2 burials, only 1 age group 3 burial, and 35 age group 4 burials, while 4 were not possible to determine as belonging to any of the groups. From 599 to 500, the use of the cemetery has increased quite a lot, with a total of 132 burials, where 30 burials could be determined as age group 1 burial, 18 as age group 2, 7 as age group 3, and 71 as age group 4. 6 burials remained undecided. And from 499 to 400, the total became 171 burials, where 10 were age group 1 burials, interestingly decreasing from the past century where we had 30 burials. 36 burials were determined as age group 2 and 20 as age group 3, again increasing from the past century. And 89 burials were determined as age group 4 burials, and 16 were undecided. As sarcophagi burials are the norm in the North Cemetery of Corinth from 700 to 400 BC for both adults and children, it most likely existed established sarcophagi workshops. This opens for the opportunity that set length times width measurements on sarcophagi produced existed. In other words, that mass production instead of order on demand was the standard procedure. If mass production was the norm, using the grave length for determining if a grave was for a child or an adult could become misleading. I therefore compared all length times width on sarcophagi in the different time periods. And as you can see, we do have clusters, but as human beings have a maximum height reachable and the fact that an average height within a population would mark itself out, this is expected. And as also can be seen, there still exists quite a high variation in the sarcophagi measurements, indicating that there was no set of stipulated measurements used, and that the grave length and the indication of position the few traces of skeletal remains give is enough for these broad age groups. So, let me now just, before I go into the finer details of the age groups in the North Cemetery from 599 to 500, I want to quickly present Hubbe Nilsen's results from Athens. From 700 to 400 BC overall, she found that the definitions of age through the mortuary practice became quite distinct and specific. The interment of the three subgroups, infant, small child, and older child, clearly separated themselves from the adults. Children were, as I have already presented, inhumed rather than cremated, with only a few exceptions. Infants were buried in enkitrismos burials, while the trend of placing small children in household terracotta basins became extremely common from 500 BC, making the infants and small children easily detectable as their own groups. The older child held a more indistinct role. Too quick. The older child held a more indistinct role regarding grave type. Their interment in pits or coffins imitates the rituals of adults, but they are still distinguishable as they also were inhumed rather than cremated, and their graves were fitted for a smaller body. The grave goods accompanying the different age groups in Athens were quite stable. And Hubbe Nilsen argued that the concepts regarding the need of children at death and burial characteristics stayed more or less unchanged over a period of 700 years. Throughout 700 to 400 BC, the infants were provided with basis for food, the small and older children with choice, and the older children with items related to its unattainable adult gender. One very important discovery she made was that the will to give a child more than 5 grave gifts increased according to age. The older the child was at death, the more likely it will be given more grave gifts. So summed up, children were inhumed while adults cremated. The graves were fitted the size of the child, and typical items such as toys, miniature vessels, and vases for food were given. The burial traditions became more and more like that of adults, the older the child was at death. So, the graves of the North Cemetery at Corinth are often discussed as being poor in grave gifts and grave goods. This could be said to be true from 700 to 600 BC, as only 17 out of the 66 graves contained any form of object. From 599 to 400 BC, however, the custom of supplying the deceased with grave gifts was practiced as extensively in Corinth as in most ancient Greek burial grounds. The most common kind of offering, considerably outnumbering other types, was pottery. And as you can see, the patterns, Hubbe Nilsen found that the older the child was at death, the more likely it would be given 5 or more objects do not appear in the North Cemetery. From 700 to 600 BC, the only burials actually given 5 or more objects were age group 1 and 2. From 599 to 500 BC, again the same pattern follows. Age group 1 and 2 have had a relatively higher chance of getting 5 or more objects. From 499 to 500 BC, age group 2 and 3 are the ones most likely to get 5 or more objects. So, before we go into the objects, I just quickly want to show you how the age groups looked. So in age group 1, 43% were urn burials, while 57% were sarcophagi burials. In age group 2, 3, and 4, all of the burials were sarcophagi burials. Sorry about the graphics. It's from the publication. It's not my fault. Let's start with the pattern found in age group 1 from 599 to 500. I found 30 burials where 20 of them contained grave goods. All of the pottery was of Corinthian production. One object clearly separated itself as being a typical grave gift to infants in the century, the pyxis. Which is normally described as being a powder box and regarded as an indication of a female burial. 13 out of the 20 burials from 599 to 500 BC had a pyxis. In the other age groups, only 8 out of the 65 graves contained a pyxis. In the publication, Hazel Palmer, who treated children as one undifferentiated group, concluded that the pyxis, instead of indicating gender, indicated age. A conclusion rightfully made, as the pyxis treated isolated do seem to indicate age. I, however, found 2 different combinations of objects accompanying the pyxis. One being a combination of a pyxis and a skythos, the other being the combination of a pyxis, a skythos, which is a cup, and an oinoko, a pitcher. These 2 objects are separately, the skythos and the pyxis, the skythos and the oinoko, quite genderless in expression. When they are found together, however, as a cup plus pitcher combination, they can possibly be connected with the symposium, very masculine activity. A pattern showing up as either being, let's just call it now, masculine or feminine. One among the 20 burials containing grave goods, I could, based on the normal affiliation attested to certain objects, contribute 6 of them as being feminine in object deposition and 9 of them as being masculine in object deposition. So, very tempting to argue that the grave objects reflected the gender of the infant buried. The pyxis, as I said, which normally was regarded as a typical feminine object, and adult burials accompanied both the feminine and masculine groups, so that contradicts that. In my master thesis, I do argue that the pyxis might have had a connection with the mother of the dead child. It also, from 499 to 400, the pyxis seems to be it just sort of disappears, but the Lekythos seems to take that place of the pyxis. So, over to the small child burials. 18 burials could be considered as belonging to age group 2 in this century, and 14 of them contained grave goods. As with age group 1, they were all given locally produced pottery. The ariballos, an oil flask, is generally connected with young men or athletes, hence a typical masculine object. The ariballos is quite evidently connected with age group 2, but not in such an obvious way as the pyxis was in age group 1. This, I would argue, is because the pyxis alone represents the infant, while the combination of the pyxis with other objects indicates a social identity. I could not, however, find any object combinations in age group 2 that as obviously indicated social identity not connected with age. There is one interesting pattern following the ariballos, however. All burials found with it had 5 or more objects. The ariballos was, in other words, never found alone or in a poor grave. Perhaps it therefore was not seen as a necessary grave gift, but rather seen as a luxury item. So, age group 3 is the least represented age group from 599 to 500 BC. I only found 7 burials that I felt could safely be considered as older child burials, where 4 of them had grave goods. None of these 4 were given more than 3 objects. But even though we have so few burials, I believe they still tell us quite a lot. First of all, none contained either a pyxis nor an ariballos, and 3 of the 4 burials were given imported Attic pottery. And as we soon will see, they seem to follow the pattern of the adult burials. So, I found 71 burials, 47 were found with grave goods. The age group 4 burials seemed at first glance to be quite poor in the number of gifts deposited. This could perhaps be explained by the origin of the objects. 25 of the 47 burials were only given locally produced pottery, whereas 7 of these had 5 or more objects. 14 of the 47 burials had both locally produced and imported Attic pottery, where 6 of them were given 5 or more objects, and 5 contained only one single Attic vessel. The remaining 3 burials had only metal objects. So, the Attic pottery was imported, and this would no doubt make it more exotic and exclusive than the local Corinthian one. I would argue that the choice of depositing Attic pottery as grave gifts was a way of showing off wealth and power. Consequently, the burials containing both Corinthian and Attic pottery can perhaps be seen as being of a higher class than the burials given only Corinthian pottery. But what then about the 5 burials which contained only one Attic vessel? 4 contained one single Helix and 1 contained a Lekythos. All of these 5 objects were of excellent quality. So, the choice of giving one object imported and of excellent quality seemed in some way to be more important than giving more objects of lesser quality and of local production. As to objects directly connected with adulthood, the Helix and Iron Pen stands out. Neither of them could be found in age group 1 or 2 burials, while the Helix could be found in 2 of the age group 4 or age group 3 burials, and the Iron Pen in 1 of them. And the Iron Pen in 1 of them. Among the adult burials, the Helix was found in 15 of the 47 burials, and the Iron Pen in 21 of the 47. I do not want to say that these objects obviously were connected to adult burials, but I think it is safe to say that the Helix and Iron Pen at least was not considered an appropriate gift for children. So, summed up. The social attitudes towards childhood in Corinth seems to have been quite similar to that in Athens, at least if we base it on mortuary practice. Even though the burial of children in Corinth seemed at first glance to be more like that of adults, it became quite evident that different traditions were attested to age. I found both objects and object groups directly connected to the different age groups, making it evident that the Corinthian population differentiated children of different ages. There is, therefore, no doubt that concepts of subgroups within children existed in the Corinthian society. I would argue that there existed a childhood or an awareness of the stages a child was in, at least among age group 1 and 2, while age group 3 was considered, at least at death, to have reached adulthood. So, thank you so much for your attention.